Ever wondered how servants became masters of a nation? For 1,000 years, they shaped Japan with blood and honor. From humble clan fighters to shogun rulers, samurai transformed through civil wars that bathed the land in chaos. While their swords conquered, their minds created Bushido, a code that outlasted their rule. When foreign ships finally shattered their world, these warriors chose death over dishonor. Though abolished in 1877, their spirit haunts Japan today. Discover how men who mastered the art of killing created a legacy of loyalty that captivates us still. Steel clashed in the dim light of dawn, hooves churning the earth as mounted archers loosed volleys into the press of men below. Banners whipped in the wind, and the cries of warriors carried across the field. A vision of the samurai age, when battle and service defined the fate of the realm. Such warriors did not spring fully formed, for how could they? They lacked the codes of loyalty, the polished discipline, even the very word samurai. What existed instead were clan levies and household guards, fighters bound by blood or convenience, their struggles fierce but unshaped by the ideals that later centuries would demand. To reach the armored horsemen of legend, we must first return to a Japan where power lay in tomb-shadowed valleys and the ambitions of rival families. Mists drifted across the plains of Yamato, clinging to the vast mounds where emperors slept in earth and stone. Around their slopes, chieftains gathered retainers, each warband proclaiming descent from divine ancestors. Spears glimmered in the pale light. Bronze mirrors caught fire from the rising sun, and scouts' cries rang across the valleys. It was not yet the time of the samurai, but already the land was learning the language of war. The Kofun period left its monuments in towering burial mounds, their shapes rising like islands in the morning mist. These tombs testified to rulers whose authority rested on arms as much as ritual, and whose legitimacy depended on demonstrating the ability to command fighters. Rival clans fought for dominance, their banners painted with emblems of divine descent, their leaders wielding swords curved slightly for the thrust and heavy bows of laminated wood. To win meant tribute, land, and prestige. To lose meant subordination to neighbors or extinction altogether. Into this unsettled landscape came influences from across the water. The kingdoms of Korea fought their own endless wars, and the ripples reached Japan's shores. Baekje, locked in deadly rivalry with Silla and Goguryeo, sent envoys bearing gifts, silk-wrapped blades, books of Chinese learning, gilded ornaments, to secure Japanese aid. Alongside these treasures came appeals for warriors, and Japanese levies soon crossed the straits to join campaigns on the peninsula. There, amid the clash of Korean horsemen and the discipline of Chinese-trained troops, Japan's fighters met a harsher reality. At Hakusukinoe in 663, their fleet fell to Tang and Silla forces in a battle that ended with disaster. Ships burned on the waves, survivors cut down on shore, and the survivors who staggered home brought back a bitter truth. Clan-based bands and improvised tactics could not withstand the organized might of continental powers. Humiliation demanded change. In Yamato's court, the lesson took root. Japan could not stand among its neighbors without transformation. Ministers looked to Tang China, where bureaucracy and standing armies bound provinces to the throne, and they dreamed of remaking Japan in that image. But to enact such vision required daring. The moment came in 645. Soga no Iruka, whose family had long dominated the court, fell to assassins within the palace itself, cut down by rivals who claimed to act in defense of imperial dignity. His death opened the way for sweeping reform. Under Emperor Kotoku, edicts were proclaimed in the name of the Taika, Great Change. Land was declared property of the throne. Clans were stripped of many privileges, and the people were ordered to serve as subjects of the sovereign rather than vassals of their uji. From these reforms grew the Gundan system, armies raised by conscription. Every able-bodied man between 20 and 60 owed service. Farmers left their fields when summoned, drilling in spear formations and bow practice. In provincial capitals, training grounds echoed with the shouts of officers teaching tactics drawn from Tang manuals. What mattered now was not the courage of individuals, but the discipline of ranks that moved as one. The reforms also sought to create a class of men who would defend the throne directly. Palace guards stood watch in uniforms marked by Chinese design, their task to protect the emperor, not as retainers of clans, but as servants of the state. Their weapons glittered during ceremonies, their presence reminding courtiers and commoners alike that power now radiated from the sovereign. Though small in number, these guards embodied the first steps toward warriors whose identity lay in service above kinship. Horses, once rare, became increasingly vital. Introduced in greater numbers from Korea, they transformed the art of war. Mounted archery spread across the archipelago, riders loosing shafts while guiding their steeds with stirrups newly adopted from the continent. The image of a warrior on horseback, bow in hand, began to overshadow that of the foot soldier with spear and shield. Centuries later, the samurai would define themselves as horse and bow men. Here were the first stirrings of that identity. The Uji-Kaban system, which ranked clans and conferred titles, also shifted under reform. Status now flowed from recognition by the throne rather than from sheer inheritance. Noble houses that once commanded independent armies saw their fighters absorbed into imperial units, their rank confirmed only if they upheld central commands. The delicate balance between ancient privilege and new order created tensions that would never fully disappear. Frontier campaigns tested the experiment. In the north, the Emishi resisted Yamato's encroachment, fighting from forests and mountains with a ferocity that baffled imperial commanders. Conscripts from distant provinces faltered in the harsh terrain, their training insufficient against ambushes and swift raids. Even victories could not secure lasting peace, for the Emishi melted into the land itself. These struggles revealed both the strength and weakness of the reformed armies. They could win set battles, but they could not easily master guerrilla war. Despite setbacks, the idea of a centralized force endured. Castles rose along rivers, stockades guarded roads, and garrisons became fixtures of the landscape. Through these efforts, the throne extended its reach farther than before, binding regions to the capital through military presence as well as ritual authority. Amid these shifts, warrior culture slowly crystallized. Fighting men were rewarded with land or exemptions from labor, strengthening the ties of service. Battles became occasions not only of survival, but of honor, where courage and loyalty won recognition. Funeral rites placed swords beside the dead, symbols that valor in life would be carried into the world beyond. The spirit of the warrior was taking shape, even if the word samurai had not yet been spoken. By the dawn of the 8th century, Japan stood transformed. The old clan wars had not vanished, but imperial reform had reshaped their meaning. The Gundan system bound commoners to military service. Palace guards protected the sovereign as symbols of central power. Cavalry spread across the land, and the frontier wars revealed the necessity of adaptable, dedicated fighters. The samurai were still centuries away, but the soil was prepared. From tomb-lined valleys and reformed courts, from the ambitions of rulers and the resilience of their foes, the first outlines of Japan's warrior tradition emerged, bronze rang against bronze, as a line of soldiers tightened their grips on shields, eyes fixed on the gates of a northern stockade. Behind them, a governor's banner snapped in the wind, its painted emblem proclaiming the emperor's will in a land still unconquered. The men were farmers only months before, drafted from rice fields into militias, now sweating in armor that pinched and weapons that felt alien in their hands. Arrows hissed down from the palisade, and one conscript stumbled, clutching at a shaft buried in his shoulder. The war against the emishi was no longer a tale from distant frontiers. It was here, in the flesh, and it demanded more than decrees written in the neat characters of the new Nara court. The founding of Heijo-kyo in 710 marked a turning point. Where once the Yamato court moved from place to place, now a permanent capital rose in the Nara basin, its grid patterned after Tang China's Chang'an. Wide avenues cut across the plain, palaces gleamed with tiled roofs, and Buddhist temples crowned hills with colossal Buddhas glimmering in the sunlight. The city proclaimed stability and order, yet beyond its walls, the countryside still belonged to provincial strongmen and the fighters who served them, a world less orderly and far less predictable than the capital's measured streets. To maintain control, the throne relied on provincial militias. In every district, households contributed men, weapons, and supplies. Muster rolls named farmers by age and obligation, while local officials drilled them in basic formations. These levies formed the backbone of frontier defense and suppression of rebellion. But farmers conscripted into service resented the disruption of their lives. Many shirked their duties, fled into mountains, or bribed their way out of campaigns. The militia system, though impressive on paper, often proved brittle in practice. These campaigns against the emishi exposed these weaknesses with brutal clarity. Raiders struck settlements in the northeast, vanishing into forests when challenged. Imperial armies marched north in long columns, only to find their supplies exhausted and their conscripts demoralized. Victories in pitched battle meant little when the enemy refused to fight on open ground. The emishi knew the terrain intimately, and their horses carried them swiftly beyond pursuit. Against such foes, the rigid Gundan system faltered. The solution came in the form of the Kondei, healthy warriors. Recruits chosen for strength and endurance, stationed long-term in provinces, rather than called up briefly from farms. Unlike reluctant peasants, these men trained continuously, their lives shaped by service. They represented an early step toward professionalization, a sign that Japan's rulers were beginning to understand that true power required more than temporary levies. Meanwhile, great temples of the Nara period amassed lands and wealth on a scale that rivaled noble houses. With estates came disputes, and with disputes came force. Monks who once devoted themselves solely to prayer now carried staves and trained in groups, prepared to defend their monasteries from rivals. These early Sohei, or warrior monks, blurred the boundary between sacred and martial life. When processions of chanting monks entered the capital bearing weapons, they unsettled courtiers as surely as any armed noble. The marriage of faith and force, born in these decades, would trouble Japanese politics for centuries. Aristocrats, too, adapted to this world. Families near the court supplied guards and commanders for provincial forces, blending martial experience with noble lineage. Young men learned not only poetry and ritual, but also how to lead troops in the emperor's name. Prestige came increasingly from the ability to defend estates and enforce order, not just from ancestral claims. The outlines of a military aristocracy began to take shape, rooted as much in service as in blood. In this atmosphere, language shifted. The verb saburo, to serve in attendance, gained new resonance. Palace guards, once described with this term, now carried weapons as well as ceremonial duties. Provincial retainers riding with governors bore the same title. Slowly, saburo ceased to mean mere attendance and began to suggest martial service. From this evolution, the later word samurai would emerge. But in the Nara period, the meaning was still in flux, caught between courtly duty and battlefield necessity. Life on campaign revealed the contrast between intention and reality. Mustered conscripts trudged north in lines stretching for miles, burdened with supplies, spears, and straw sandals that wore through on rocky passes. Discipline sometimes dissolved into desertion, yet among them a few discovered aptitude for soldiering. These men gravitated to the ranks of the Conde, staying on after others returned to farms, beginning the slow transformation of fighting from obligation into profession. Temples trained their defenders differently. Within cloisters, monks rehearsed chants in unison, then turned to practice with staves, their movements sharp and deliberate. To them, martial discipline was an extension of spiritual devotion, each strike an act of focus, each formation a mirror of monastic order. Outsiders saw contradiction, holy men with weapons, but to the monks themselves, defense of the Dharma justified arms. The throne's authority depended upon balancing these forces. Reluctant militias, trained conde, ambitious nobles, and armed monks. Governors sent to provinces struggled to assert control, often finding their orders ignored by local power holders. Reports flowed back to Nara, detailing shortages, mutinies, and outright defiance. Behind the capital's facade of Chinese-inspired order lay a patchwork reality, where loyalty was constantly negotiated and military power rested as much on persuasion as on command. Still, progress was undeniable. Forts rose along northern rivers, their wooden walls bristling with watchtowers. New tactics spread through the provinces. Cavalry units drilled with bows, patrols learned to scout in hostile terrain, and supply lines were better secured. Though costly and uneven, these efforts carved a firmer imperial presence in lands once beyond the court's grasp. By the close of the 8th century, Japan stood at a crossroads. The Nara capital symbolized centralized rule, yet the engine of power remained dispersed. Provincial militias struggled to serve effectively, but the emergence of the Conde hinted at a shift towards standing forces. Monks armed in defense of their temples foreshadowed the entanglement of religion and war. Aristocrats blended courtly refinement with martial command, creating a social space where warriors could rise. And within language itself, the word saburo began its slow journey toward samurai, a title that would one day echo through centuries of Japanese history. The samurai had not yet arrived, but their shadow already stretched across the land. Torches flickered along the bridge at Uji as mounted warriors leaned forward in their saddles, arrows ready on taut strings. Beneath them, the river foamed with the spring melt, its roar drowned by the cries of men preparing for combat. The clash that followed, lords, retainers, monks, and mercenaries, all drawn into conflict, signaled the dawn of an age when provincial fighters, not imperial conscripts, would decide the fate of the realm. Yet this moment was centuries in the making, born from the slow unraveling of the old conscript system and the rise of private power across the provinces. When the court moved its capital to Heian-kyo in 794, it sought permanence and refinement. broad avenues mirrored Tangchangan. Noble mansions gleamed with painted screens, and temples crowned the city with spiritual grandeur. Within palace walls, poetry contests and ceremonies eclipsed talk of war. But beyond the capital's ordered streets, reality told another story. Provincial unrest simmered, and the institutions created by the Taika reforms could no longer control the land as intended. The conscript armies of the Nara period had proved cumbersome and unpopular. Farmers resisted call-ups, governors falsified reports, and the Gundan system collapsed under its own weight. In its place emerged private forces raised by aristocrats, provincial elites, and wealthy temples. These fighters, no longer bound by seasonal service but by personal obligation, brought new flexibility to warfare. Loyalty shifted from the distant court to the immediate lord who paid or protected them. Across the provinces, landed families discovered that defending their estates required more than paperwork. They built fortified manors, recruited local bands, and turned surplus wealth into armed strength. These household warriors collected rents, guarded harvests, and kept bandits at bay. Over time, they gained reputation and cohesion, becoming something more than hired muscle. They were protectors of estates, precursors of the samurai class that would dominate the centuries to follow. Meanwhile, the throne still maintained its elite guards. Units such as the Konoe, palace guards, served with ceremonial splendor, their armor polished, their formations displayed during rituals. Yet their function was as much symbolic as practical, a reminder of imperial dignity rather than a decisive military force. Real power shifted steadily outward, into provinces where private armies were tested daily against rivals and raiders. The rise of provincial fighters coincided with the growing prominence of great warrior clans. Among them, the Taira and the Minamoto stood foremost. Both traced descent from imperial lines, the Taira from Emperor Kanmu, the Minamoto from various emperors who granted the name to collateral branches. With court recognition came prestige. With provincial estates came manpower. These clans blended noble blood with practical military command, embodying the fusion of aristocracy and martial strength that defined the Heian Age. Conflicts in the mid-12th century revealed how decisive these houses had become. The Hogan disturbance of 1156 erupted from a dispute over imperial succession, drawing the Taira and Minamoto into opposite camps. The fighting in Kyoto's streets was brief but brutal, ending with burned palaces and slain nobles. It marked more than a political squabble. It demonstrated that disputes of succession could no longer be resolved by ritual alone. They required armed intervention. Only 3 years later, the Heiji disturbance of 1159 confirmed the trend. In a sudden coup, Minamoto warriors seized Kyoto, but Taira no Kiyomori countered with decisive force. The city once again burned, captives were executed, and the Taira emerged dominant. Kiyomori's victory made him the first warrior to rule the court itself, his clan's power eclipsing that of traditional aristocrats. Through violence, the balance of the realm had shifted. Such upheavals were rooted not only in ambition, but also in the gradual evolution of warrior culture. Early fighters prized valor and lineage, but Heian warriors began to articulate ideals of loyalty, duty, and service. Tales and war songs celebrated those who stood by their lords unto death, or who charged recklessly into the enemy for honor's sake. These proto-Bushido values were not yet codified, but the seeds had been sown. Life for these warriors was not only battle. Many served as estate managers, tax collectors, and enforcers of order. They ensured rice reached the capital, kept peasants in line, and mediated disputes with neighboring estates. Service with sword and bow was only one side of their identity. Administration and discipline defined them just as much. Over time, their households grew into stable retainer bands, linked by ties of loyalty and rewarded through land or exemptions. Temples and monasteries remained formidable forces. Their warrior monks marched in processions with weapons in hand, pressing demands upon the court. Armed clashes between rival temples erupted in the capital itself, where burning halls and smashed images testified to the mingling of piety and violence. The court often found itself powerless before these armed clergy, turning instead to warrior families for defense. Thus, secular and religious forces alike relied increasingly on provincial strength. Despite the turbulence, court culture remained dazzling. Aristocrats refined arts of poetry, calligraphy, and ritual, while delegating the harsher business of enforcement to their provincial allies. Warriors who gained access to the capital discovered a world of elegance far removed from muddy fields. Some learned its forms, balancing martial prowess with cultured manners. Others remained outsiders, their rough edges marking the contrast between the polished Heian court and the realities of provincial power. In this world of contrasts, identity shifted. Warriors were still servants, still those who saburo, but their service took new shape. They fought less as conscripts bound by decree, and more as loyal men bound by oath. Their weapons defended not the state as an abstraction, but the estates, families, and lords whose fortunes they shared. Through such bonds, the outlines of the samurai way began to emerge, though the word itself was only just acquiring its martial sense. The late Heian period thus marked a threshold. Conscription had withered, private armies flourished. Great clans rose to prominence, temples wielded soldiers, and the court increasingly leaned upon provincial might. The Hogan and Heiji disturbances showed how far this shift had gone, as succession disputes ended not with compromise but with blood. From the courtly streets of Kyoto to the contested fields of the provinces, the balance of Japan's power tilted irrevocably toward the warriors. And when that balance tipped fully, the samurai would cease to be mere servants and become the rulers of the realm. The river at Uji thundered with spring flood, its surface a torrent of foam and broken branches. Across it stretched the bridge, narrow, fragile, and the only path by which the enemy could pass. Minamoto warriors swung their axes, smashing planks until gaps opened over the racing water. Arrows hissed overhead, monks from Midera loosing shafts as they chanted sutras for courage. On the far bank, the Taira host gathered in glittering ranks, banners rippling red against the sky. In that moment, the struggle for Japan's future was not decided by emperors in palaces, but by men on horseback, by blades clashing over a river in flood. The Genpei War began in fire and fury in 1180, when Taira no Kiyomori's dominance over the court provoked rebellion. His clan, enriched by maritime trade and entrenched in Kyoto's politics, seemed unassailable, yet power bred enemies. Disinherited aristocrats, monks embittered by Taira interference, and ambitious Minamoto leaders found common cause. When Prince Mochihito, scion of the imperial line, issued his call to arms against the Taira, he offered legitimacy to grievances that had long simmered. The summons echoed across provinces, drawing men who saw in rebellion both duty and opportunity. At first, the revolt faltered. Mochihito fled through the capital, only to be hunted down and killed. But the Minamoto endured. Bands rallied under different branches of the family, some crushed, others enduring. Among them rose Minamoto no Yoritomo, exiled for decades in the east, who now gathered warriors in Kamakura. His foothold in the Kanto plains, far from Kyoto's reach, gave him the independence to build a power base rooted in provincial warriors rather than courtly allies. Meanwhile, battles flared across the land. At Uji, monks and warriors fought side by side, their destruction of the bridge buying precious hours before the Taira forced their way across. In the west, estates burned as rival clans turned fields into battlegrounds. In the east, Yoritomo's banners multiplied as lesser lords pledged allegiance. The war was more than a contest between two houses. It was the eruption of a new political order, one that elevated provincial strength over courtly pedigree. By 1183, the conflict reached its first great turning point. Minamoto no Yoshinaka, cousin to Yoritomo, swept into Kyoto with his followers. The Taira, forced to retreat, carried with them the young Emperor Antoku and the imperial regalia, retreating to their western strongholds. For a moment, Yoshinaka stood triumphant in the capital, but his rough manners and arrogant claims alienated nobles and fellow warriors alike. His ambition overreached, and soon he found himself challenged by his own kin. The clash came at the Battle of Awazu in 1184. Yoshinaka's forces, pressed hard, broke beneath the onslaught of Minamoto brothers Yoshitsune and Noriori, loyal to Yoritomo. Legends tell of Tomoe Gozen, a female warrior riding into combat with bow and sword, her valor rivaling that of any man on the field. She cut her way through foes before vanishing from history, leaving behind a tale that echoed through generations. Yoshinaka fell in the chaos, his brief grasp at power ending in blood. Kyoto once more bore witness to flames. Palaces burned, and the shifting tides of war left the city battered and exhausted. The court, long accustomed to manipulating rival clans, found itself powerless before the sheer momentum of military struggle. The real contest moved westward, where the Taira gathered strength for a final stand. In 1184, Yoshitsune and Noriori struck again, this time against Taira fortresses. At Ichinotani, they launched a daring attack from the mountains, charging down slopes thought impassable. Horses thundered into the rear of the Taira camp as allies pressed from the front. Panic spread, and the once mighty clan suffered grievous losses. Survivors fled to ships, retreating along the inland sea. The next year brought the Battle of Yashima. Taira forces, entrenched on an island stronghold, believed themselves secure behind the sea. Yoshitsune proved otherwise. Leading his men across treacherous waters, he struck swiftly at night, seizing the shore and forcing the enemy to scatter. Tales linger of a Taira fan placed atop a mast as a challenge, and of Nasu no Yoichi, the archer who loosed a single arrow that struck it true, earning eternal renown. Such moments, half history, half legend, reveal how the Genpei War embedded itself in memory, not only as conflict, but as story. The struggle reached its climax in 1185 at Dan no Ura, a naval battle fought in the narrow straits off Shimonoseki. Fleets maneuvered across turbulent tides as arrows rained and ships crashed together. At first, the Taira pressed their advantage, their vessels surrounding Minamoto craft. But fortune turned when defectors revealed the enemy's formation. Minamoto warriors boarded Taira ships, cutting down defenders in desperate melee. As defeat loomed, the Taira made their final, tragic choice. The young Emperor Antoku, only 7 years old, was taken in his grandmother's arms and plunged into the sea, vanishing with the sacred regalia. Many nobles followed, leaping into the waves rather than facing capture. By day's end, the waters of Dan no Ura carried wreckage, bodies, and the extinguished glory of the Taira clan. The victory left Minamoto no Yoritomo supreme. From his base in Kamakura, he consolidated power, rewarding allies with estates and appointing trusted men as governors and stewards. Shugo and Jito, across provinces. These measures bypassed the court, establishing direct warrior control over land and justice. The emperor remained a sacred figure, but authority had shifted decisively. The age of warrior government had begun. The Genpei War also left behind stories of individuals who embodied its spirit. Minamoto no Yoshitsune, brilliant and audacious, won glory at Ichinotani, Yashima, and Dan no Ura, his tactics daring to the point of recklessness. His companion Benki, the warrior monk, stood as the very image of loyalty, said to have died on his feet, bristling with arrows yet unyielding. These figures blurred the line between history and legend, shaping the image of the warrior as not merely a fighter, but a symbol of devotion and honor. Women, too, appeared in chronicles. From Toma Gozen, riding with sword in hand, to noble women, enduring exile, defeat, and flight. Their presence reminds us that the Genpei War was not fought only by men with swords, but endured by families, households, and communities caught in its fire. Beyond the victories and tragedies, the war carried deep consequences. It destroyed the illusion that the court could manage warrior clans as instruments of policy. Instead, the warriors themselves seized control, proving that legitimacy followed the sword. The Minamoto triumph set the stage for the Kamakura shogunate, Japan's first warrior government, which would define the centuries to come. In the straits of Dan no Ura, as the tide turned and the Taira sank, Japan's future shifted. The samurai were no longer servants in the shadows of court nobles. They had claimed their place as the rulers of the land. Horses thundered over Kamakura's roads, their riders' armor shining beneath the coastal glare. Messengers carried orders sealed with the Minamoto crest, racing between the shogun's headquarters and the estates of loyal retainers. In the bustling capital, carpenters hammered at new barracks, smiths struck sparks from iron, and scribes bent over documents that appointed governors to distant provinces. Far away in Kyoto, the emperor still performed ancient rituals before the sun goddess. But the pulse of power had shifted. From the quiet inlets of Sagami Bay, a new order spread across Japan. An order ruled not from the chrysanthemum throne, but from the command post of the shogun. When Minamoto no Yoritomo emerged victorious after the Genpei War, he faced a challenge unlike any previous warrior: how to govern a land that stretched from northern frontiers to the southern seas. Victory alone was not enough. To secure authority, he needed institutions as enduring as the sword. In 1192, imperial sanction named him Sei Taishogun, great general of the subduing of barbarians. Yet this was not a simple transfer of sovereignty. The emperor remained a sacred figure in Kyoto, while Yoritomo built his own administration in Kamakura. Japan entered an age of dual rule, the Bakufu and the court sharing space uneasily, like two suns in the same sky. From Kamakura, Yoritomo established the framework of military government. He appointed Jito, estate stewards, to manage lands, collect taxes, and ensure order. Shugo, military governors, oversaw provinces, charged with raising troops, suppressing rebellions, and guarding highways. These appointments bypassed the aristocrats of Kyoto, redirecting authority into the hands of warriors. Land disputes, once settled by court precedent, now came before the Mandakoro administrative office in Kamakura, where scribes recorded verdicts and retainers enforced them with steel. For the first time, warriors enjoyed a system designed to serve their interests rather than marginalize them. Kyoto still glittered with pageantry. Courtiers held poetry contests beneath painted screens. Monks debated doctrine in cloisters, and the emperor performed rituals older than memory. But the wealth that sustained this refinement increasingly flowed through Kamakura's channels. Warriors respected the throne as a sacred institution. yet their loyalty belonged to the shogun, who protected their rights and rewarded their service. The balance of Japan's governance tilted steadily toward the east. The new system was not without strains. Yoritomo's death in 1199 left his heirs young and inexperienced. His widow, Hojo Masako, stepped forward with remarkable resolve. Known as the nun shogun, after she took Buddhist vows, Masako wielded authority with a steadiness that astonished rivals. Together with her father and brothers, she established the Hojo Regency, ensuring that the shogunate remained in family hands, even as the Minamoto line dwindled. From behind temple walls, she summoned warriors, quashed rebellions, and reminded retainers that the legacy of Yoritomo lived on through her guardianship. The Hojo Regency soon faced its greatest challenge. In 1221, Emperor Go-Toba, determined to restore imperial power, raised banners in what became the Jokyu War. Courtiers whispered of a return to the old order, of the throne reclaiming supremacy. But Kamakura's warriors answered Masako's call. Hosts poured westward, disciplined and determined. When they reached Kyoto, imperial defenders crumbled. The emperor was exiled, his supporters stripped of lands, and the shogunate emerged stronger than ever. The Jokyu War revealed the stark truth. Emperors might claim descent from the sun goddess, but warriors now held the sword arm of the state. Even as the regency stabilized rule, the threat of foreign invasion loomed. In 1274, ships bearing Mongol soldiers appeared off Hakata Bay. Their arrival stunned Japan. Riders from the steppe, allied with Korean sailors, brought tactics unfamiliar to samurai. Massed volleys of arrows, disciplined formations, even explosives that burst like thunder. The defenders fought with valor, charging in single combat as tradition demanded, but the Mongols pressed with relentless coordination. As night fell, a storm scattered the invaders' fleet, saving the islands from conquest. Warriors called it divine intervention, a wind sent by the gods. The danger did not pass. In 1281, a second invasion force arrived, larger and more determined. Samurai clashed with Mongols along hastily built walls at Hakata, battles raging for weeks. Again, the tide turned through a storm of extraordinary ferocity that wrecked much of the enemy fleet. The survivors who reached shore were hunted down. Japan had withstood the might of the greatest empire of its age, and the victory confirmed the warriors' conviction that the gods favored their rule. Still, triumph carried hidden costs. Unlike domestic wars, where victory brought estates to divide among followers, the Mongol invasions yielded no new lands. Retainers who had fought with courage expected reward, but the Bakufu had little to give. Discontent simmered, and loyalty wavered when obligations went unmet. The very system that had secured Japan faltered under the weight of its own success. Meanwhile, cultural life flourished under warrior patronage. Zen Buddhism, carried by monks returning from China, found eager disciples among samurai. Its emphasis on discipline, meditation, and simplicity resonated with a class accustomed to hardship. Zen gardens, with their raked gravel and carefully placed stones, reflected the order warriors sought in a chaotic world. No theater began as ritual performance, but evolved into art under samurai sponsorship, its austere masks and measured chants echoing the ideals of restraint and endurance. The sword remained central, yet warriors also became patrons of poetry, tea, and architecture, shaping a culture both martial and refined. Despite these achievements, cracks widened. By the 14th century, economic strain, factional disputes, and resentment toward the Hojo Regency weakened the shogunate's foundations. States grew restless under the burden of taxation. and rivals waited for opportunity. In 1331, Emperor Go-Daigo seized his chance. Declaring his intent to restore imperial authority, he raised a rebellion. For 2 years, the land shook with conflict as warriors chose sides. Some clung to the Hojo, others rallied to the emperor's vision. The end came in 1333, when Ashikaga Takauji, once a loyal commander of the Hojo, turned against them. His betrayal split their defenses, and Kamakura fell amid fire and slaughter. The regents who had ruled for over a century perished, their power extinguished. For a brief moment, the emperor's banner flew triumphant, promising a return to direct rule. But the age of imperial restoration was short. From the ashes of Kamakura's fall rose yet another warrior regime, one that would carry Japan into its next era of strife. The Kamakura shogunate had endured for nearly 150 years. It had survived internal dissent, crushed imperial resistance, and repelled the Mongol threat. More importantly, it had established the pattern of warrior government, a dual system where emperors reigned but samurai ruled. From Kamakura's seaside headquarters, warriors learned not only to fight but to govern, to judge disputes, and to build institutions that outlasted their founders. Their experiment in shared sovereignty reshaped Japan, ensuring that from this time forward, no ruler could ignore the will of the sword. The smoke of burning temples rose over Kyoto as warriors clashed in the streets, their banners whipping in summer winds. Shouts echoed through corridors, once meant for poetry recitals, while arrows shattered the lacquered gates of aristocratic mansions. In the chaos strode Ashikaga Takauji, armored and implacable, his betrayal of the emperor's cause reshaping the balance of the realm. Not long before, he had marched under the banner of imperial restoration. Now he turned his sword against the throne itself, seizing the capital and declaring his own supremacy. From that reversal began an age of contradiction, of warriors enthroned as rulers, yet too weak to command unity, of Japan split between rival courts, and of culture flourishing even as political authority decayed. In 1333, the Kamakura shogunate collapsed when Emperor Go-Daigo, intent on reviving imperial authority, called the realm to rebellion. His supporters rallied to the cause of the throne, and for a brief moment it seemed that the ancient ideal of a sovereign unchallenged might return. But warriors who had fought to topple the Hojo soon discovered that the emperor's promises brought little reward. Land disputes multiplied, obligations went unmet, and resentment spread among those who had risked everything. Into this discontent stepped Ashikaga Takauji. Sent originally to suppress the rebellion, he shifted allegiance, seeing in the emperor's failures an opportunity for himself. His seizure of Kyoto in 1336 ended the Kenmu Restoration and set the stage for a new warrior government. Yet legitimacy could not be claimed so easily. Go-Daigo refused to yield, retreating south to Yoshino, where he established a rival throne. Thus began the age of the northern and southern courts, when two emperors claimed Japan, and loyalty to one meant defiance of the other. Warriors across the provinces faced agonizing choices. Some rallied to the northern court, enthroned under Ashikaga protection in Kyoto. Others swore to Go-Daigo's southern court, honoring the claim of uninterrupted imperial descent. Battles flared from mountain valleys to coastal plains, castles seized and retaken, allegiances shifting as fortunes rose and fell. Yet beneath the rhetoric of legitimacy, the reality was clear. The Ashikaga shogunate survived not through unbroken loyalty, but through pragmatic alliances, negotiated daily with provincial lords who demanded reward in land and privilege. Unlike the Kamakura regime, the Ashikaga lacked the firm structures of stewardship and governance that had once bound warriors to their center. Authority radiated weakly from Kyoto, where the shogun relied on personal charisma and shifting coalitions rather than enduring institutions. The consequence was fragmentation. Provincial governors, once instruments of central control, grew into autonomous warlords. Their titles gave them legal sanction, but their power derived from military might. Over time, they became shugo daimyo, regional lords who carved out dominions that owed only nominal allegiance to Kyoto. Even so, in the midst of political weakness, cultural achievement reached dazzling heights. Zen Buddhism, patronized by the Ashikaga and their allies, infused art, architecture, and philosophy. Monks returning from China brought with them ink painting, garden design, and the contemplative practices of meditation. In Kyoto's temples, dry landscapes of raked gravel and carefully placed stones embodied spiritual discipline. The tea ceremony, refined in these decades, expressed ideals of simplicity and restraint that resonated deeply with warriors who sought order in a fractured age. The shogunate itself became a patron of the arts. Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, the third shogun, presided over a court whose splendor rivaled that of the old Heian aristocracy. His pavilion at Kinkakuji, the Golden Pavilion, shimmered above its reflecting pond, a vision of elegance that concealed the instability beneath. Yoshimitsu cultivated Chinese trade, sending ships across the seas in exchange for silk, porcelain, and books. Through this commerce, the warriors of Japan found themselves connected to the wider currents of East Asia, even as their own provinces seethed with unrest. In provincial domains, power hardened in new forms. Castles, once simple stockades, grew into fortified centers of authority. Stone walls, watchtowers, and moats transformed the landscape, symbols of lords who no longer relied on Kyoto for defense. From these strongholds, shugo daimyo administered justice, collected taxes, and mustered armies. Their households expanded, retainer bands swelling into permanent military organizations. Service was rewarded with land and stipends, forging ties of loyalty that surpassed old clan bonds. Still, the image of the warrior retained its dual aspect. On one hand, he was the sword-bearing enforcer of provincial lords, his armor lacquered black, his bow and spear ready at command. On the other, he became the patron of temples, gardens, and theaters. It was in this period that no drama flourished under warrior sponsorship, its slow, deliberate movements and austere masks reflecting both spiritual contemplation and martial gravity. To attend a performance in a Kyoto hall was to glimpse the paradox of the Ashikaga era. Violence and refinement entwined like ivy on stone. Tensions between center and province never eased. The shogunate's reliance on negotiated power meant that when disputes broke out, Kyoto had little strength to impose resolution. Shugo daimyo fought one another for territory, their private wars devastating the countryside. Peasants bore the burden, their rice fields trampled, their labor seized for fortifications. Some rose in protest, banding together in leagues that refused taxes and resisted officials. These ikki foreshadowed the social unrest that would later sweep across Japan. Ashikaga Yoshimitsu sought to stabilize his rule through magnificence and diplomacy. He even entertained claims to equal status with the Chinese emperor, styling himself King of Japan in correspondence. His court glittered, but the stability he forged was personal, not institutional. After his death in 1408, factionalism returned. Later, shoguns lacked his authority, and the fragile balance fractured again. By the mid-15th century, the shogunate's weakness was plain. Successive rulers struggled to control their own retainers, much less the provinces. Disputes over succession and favoritism split the capital into rival camps. In the provinces, Shugo daimyo ruled with near independence, building their own networks of vassals. The duality of the Ashikaga age lay bare. Cultural brilliance gleamed in Kyoto's temples, while political control withered beyond its walls. The stage was set for disaster. In 1467, a dispute over succession to the shogunate erupted into open conflict. Armies marched into Kyoto, each side claiming legitimacy, each backed by powerful lords. The resulting conflagration, known as the Onin War, reduced the capital to ruins and scattered refugees across the land. For 10 years, fighting turned neighborhoods into charnel grounds, temples into fortresses, and palaces into ashes. When the smoke cleared, the authority of the Ashikaga shogunate lay shattered. What endured was not centralized rule, but the power of provincial lords, hardened by years of war and sustained by their castles and retainers. Out of the wreckage of the Ashikaga order rose the age of the Sengoku daimyo, warlords whose ambition recognized no master but themselves. The Ashikaga era, stretching from Takauji's betrayal to the Onin War, was thus a time of paradox. Politically fragile, it failed to unify the land. Yet culturally, it produced achievements that still define Japanese identity. Warriors who could not govern effectively, nonetheless, fostered Zen gardens, no drama, and the tea ceremony. Their weakness gave rise to fragmentation, but their patronage gave Japan a cultural legacy as enduring as their castles were temporary. Ash and smoke hung heavy over Kyoto as soldiers stalked through the ruins of what had once been noble mansions. Roof beams jutted like broken ribs, screens painted with poems and landscapes lay charred in the mud, and temple bells cracked in the firestorm lay silent. Along alleyways, armored retainers looted with abandon, while bands of foot soldiers stripped corpses of their armor. The capital, for centuries, the heart of culture and ceremony, had become a battlefield. It was here that the Onin War turned Japan from fragile unity into a land consumed by ceaseless strife. The conflict began not with foreign invasion, but with dispute over succession. In 1467, Shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa faced the problem of heirs. His brother Yoshimi and his infant son Yoshihisa both had claims, and factions formed behind each. What should have been a courtly quarrel spiraled outward as powerful Shugo daimyo chose sides. The Yamana clan supported the shogun's brother, while the Hosokawa threw their weight behind his son. Old rivalries sharpened, alliances hardened, and soon armies marched not only for principle, but for survival. Kyoto became the prize, and within its streets war erupted. Mansions of the aristocracy transformed into fortresses, their gates reinforced, their gardens converted into killing grounds. Soldiers occupied temples, firing arrows from pagoda balconies. Neighbors turned against neighbors, and each block bore the banner of a faction. The shogun himself proved powerless, his voice drowned by the roar of conflict. The very city that symbolized imperial authority descended into ruin. Beyond Kyoto, provinces mirrored the chaos. Shugo daimyo, once appointed as governors, discovered that central authority no longer restrained them. Many acted as independent rulers, raising armies larger than anything the shogunate could field. Loyalty to Kyoto gave way to personal ambition, and the war in the capital emboldened lords to settle scores of their own. The fragile fabric of Ashikaga authority unraveled, thread by thread, across the islands. The devastation struck ordinary people most cruelly. Peasants who had labored for harvests saw their fields trampled by marching armies. Markets emptied, famine spread, and disease followed in the wake of destruction. Yet out of hardship came new forms of resistance. Villagers formed leagues, or iki, pledging to defend themselves against predatory lords and tax collectors. Some leagues seized castles, declared communal governance, and held out for years before being crushed. Their uprisings revealed the extent to which central order had collapsed, and local communities struggled to survive by their own strength. A new kind of soldier also rose to prominence: the Ashigaru, or Lightfoot warriors. Drawn from the ranks of peasants and wanderers, these men joined armies for pay or plunder. Ill-equipped at first, they soon became indispensable. Ashigaru swarmed across battlefields with spears and pikes, overwhelming aristocratic retainers accustomed to duels of mounted archery. Their numbers gave them strength, and their presence marked a shift from elite warrior bands to mass armies. The rise of the Ashigaru signaled a democratization of violence, where warfare no longer belonged solely to hereditary fighters. The transformation of castles reflected the age. No longer were they mere wooden stockades. Now they became stone fortresses, commanding hills and valleys. Lords recognized that control required permanent strongholds, centers from which to rule and resist. Around these castles, merchants and artisans gathered, seeking protection in exchange for goods and services. Thus were born the first castle towns, embryonic cities that tied commerce to military might. They foreshadowed the Japan of the Sengoku era, where warlords ruled not only through arms, but also through economic networks centered on fortified hubs. Meanwhile, the capital endured year after year of conflict. Fires consumed neighborhoods, famines stalked survivors, and once glorious temples lay in ruins. The shogunate's inability to restore order stripped it of all credibility. Even the emperor, cloistered in the palace, could do little but watch as his city crumbled. Poets lamented the fall of Heian's splendor, comparing it to the decline of dynasties in China, and survivors spoke of Kyoto as a ghost city where the cries of the hungry echoed louder than the chants of monks. Among the warlords, no side achieved decisive victory. The Hosokawa and Yamana fought bitterly, but the struggle drained both clans. What began as a contest for succession dissolved into stalemate, each side too exhausted to destroy the other. The war that had begun with banners and proclamations ended in stalemate and devastation. By 1477, combat subsided, but not because peace had been won, rather because Kyoto no longer offered anything worth fighting for. The city lay ruined, its wealth gone, its people scattered. The consequences stretched far beyond the capital. Shugo daimyo, weakened by endless war, could no longer maintain tight control over their territories. Their vassals, ambitious retainers who commanded their own armies, began to assert independence. This phenomenon of Gekkokujo, the low overthrowing the high, became the defining feature of the next age. Retainers seized power from their lords, and new warlords rose from unexpected origins. The hierarchy that had once defined warrior society crumbled, replaced by a brutal meritocracy of strength and cunning. For peasants and merchants, the chaos brought both suffering and opportunity. Those who survived carved niches in the new order, attaching themselves to local lords or relocating to the safety of castle towns. Commerce, though disrupted, began to cluster around these fortified centers, laying the foundations for new urban life. Kyoto had burned, but in its ashes grew the seeds of regional hubs that would one day challenge its supremacy. More than a decade of carnage came with the Onin War, but its lasting mark was disunity. It destroyed the authority of the Ashikaga shogunate, crippled the capital, and unleashed forces that no central ruler could control. From 1477 onward, Japan entered the Sengoku, the age of warring states, when hundreds of domains fought for dominance. In this world, the samurai became not just retainers, but the very rulers of society, their swords carving the boundaries of power. The war's memory lingered as a warning and a lesson. Chroniclers wrote of mansions consumed by fire, of noblewomen fleeing barefoot through the night, of monks slaughtered in temple halls. They described Kyoto as a field of ashes, where foxes roamed among ruined palaces. Yet from this devastation emerged the world that would produce Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, the unifiers who would eventually restore order. The Onin War was the threshold. Behind lay the fading splendor of Ashikaga Kyoto. Ahead stretched a century of unrelenting struggle. The descent into chaos was complete. Japan had entered a new age where ambition knew no master, and the only law was the sword. The sound of hammers echoed through the valley as peasants, craftsmen, and warriors labored side by side. Timber frames rose, stones were hauled into place, and ditches filled with water. At the center of the construction stood a keep of unprecedented scale, its towers commanding every road and field in sight. Around its base clustered rows of new dwellings, markets, workshops, and inns, forming a settlement drawn together by the promise of protection and profit. This was not merely a fortress, it was the heart of a new society. Across Japan in the late 15th century, castles like this multiplied, each a symbol of lordship and ambition. The Sengoku age had begun, an era when every domain became a battlefield, and every stronghold the seed of a city. Japan lay in ruins after the chaos of the Onin War. The Ashikaga shogunate remained in Kyoto, but its authority was a shadow of its former self. The city lay in ruins, aristocrats impoverished, and the court reduced to ceremonial impotence. Across the provinces, power flowed not to shoguns or emperors, but to ambitious lords who carved domains by force of arms. These were the Sengoku daimyo, warlords of the warring states, each determined to survive and expand in a world where alliances shifted as quickly as the wind. Their rise was marked by the collapse of traditional hierarchies. Shugo daimyo, once secure as provincial governors, found themselves challenged by their own retainers. The principle of Gekko Kujo, the low overthrowing the high, became the rule of the age. A retainer who seized his lord's lands and held them by sword quickly found recognition from neighbors. For in the Sengoku world, legitimacy followed success, not pedigree. Families of humble origin could rise to prominence. Great clans could vanish in a single generation. In this climate, warfare transformed. No longer were battles dominated by mounted archers engaging in ritual duels. Instead, armies swelled with ashigaru, peasant foot soldiers who fought with spears, pikes, and eventually firearms. Lords recognized that massed infantry could decide battles where aristocratic retainers had once held sway. Organization and discipline mattered more than lineage, and clever commanders trained their men to maneuver as cohesive units. The battlefield became less a stage for individual valor and more a crucible of strategy. Castles anchored this new order. Unlike the hilltop fortifications of earlier centuries, Sengoku castles dominated plains and river valleys. Stone bases supported towers that loomed over the countryside, while moats and walls forced attackers into killing zones. Around these castles grew towns where merchants thrived under the protection of the garrison. The daimyo who commanded such centers controlled not only soldiers, but also trade routes, artisans, and markets. Economic power intertwined with military strength, creating domains that functioned as miniature states. Among the most formidable of these domains were those ruled by men whose names became legends. In Kai Province, Takeda Shingen forged an army renowned for cavalry charges and discipline, his red banners striking fear into rivals. Across Echigo, Uesugi Kenshin, celebrated as the Dragon of Echigo, matched him in skill and piety, leading troops with prayers to the war god Bishamonten. Their clashes at Kawanakajima became the stuff of song and story, battles fought with fury, yet often ending inconclusively, as if the land itself refused to choose between them. Other lords built power through administration as well as arms. The Imagawa controlled Tokai provinces with careful governance, while the Hojo in the Kanto established systems of taxation, law, and urban planning that made their Odawara castle a center of prosperity. The Chosokabe of Shikoku and the Shimazu of Kyushu carved dominions by balancing conquest with shrewd diplomacy. Each daimyo experimented with rules, issuing house codes that regulated vassals' behavior, forbade treachery, and imposed standards of justice. These codes revealed the transformation of warriors from mere fighters into rulers of organized domains. The Sengoku era also witnessed a revolution from beyond Japan's shores. In 1543, Portuguese traders landed on Tanegashima, bringing with them the matchlock musket. Within a generation, firearms spread across the islands. At first novelty, they soon reshaped tactics. Daimyo armed Ashigaru with ranks of gunners, whose volleys cut down charging cavalry. The old dominance of mounted archers crumbled before the thunder of organized gunfire. Samurai continued to prize the bow and sword, but they could no longer ignore the power of black powder. With firearms came other foreign influences. Missionaries arrived in the 1540s, preaching Christianity and establishing footholds in Kyushu. Some lords embraced the new faith, seeing in it both spiritual promise and access to trade with Europeans. Others resisted, wary of foreign gods. The presence of Jesuits, merchants, and strange new weapons added yet another layer of complexity to a society already torn by civil war. Amid the violence, cultural life adapted. Tea gatherings, refined by masters like Sen no Rikyu, became occasions where daimyo demonstrated taste, discipline, and authority. Castles included gardens and chambers designed for tea, balancing the austerity of Zen with the grandeur of martial power. No performances continued under warrior patronage, while ink painting and calligraphy flourished in castle towns. Even in the midst of ceaseless war, art provided a measure of order and identity. The daily lives of commoners shifted as well. Peasants bore the burdens of military campaigns, providing food, labor, and often their own sons as a shigaru. Yet castle towns offered opportunities for artisans and merchants. Markets bustled with trade in rice, cloth, salt, and iron. Guilds formed, and urban communities developed new identities. In some domains, peasants organized leagues to negotiate with lords, proving that even amid war, local agency could not be entirely suppressed. Battles remained constant, brutal, and transformative. In provinces across the islands, fields became graveyards, and rivers ran red after clashes. Lords rose and fell with dizzying speed. A single defeat could erase a clan's fortunes, while victory might elevate a former retainer to power. Alliances shifted endlessly, sealed by marriages one year and broken by betrayal the next. The Sengoku era was a crucible where ambition was tested daily, and survival depended on both sword and cunning. By the mid-16th century, the pattern of the age was clear. The old order of Shugo had vanished, replaced by Sengoku daimyo, who commanded real power. Their castles anchored domains. Their armies of Ashigaru and samurai fought with spear, bow and gun, and their codes governed vassals with rules as strict as any imperial edict. Japan was no longer a realm of competing courts and noble houses, but a patchwork of warlord states, each striving for supremacy. And yet, within the chaos, the possibility of unification stirred. Daimyo dreamed of extending their rule beyond provincial borders, of binding the fractured land under a single banner. Rivalries between Takeda and Wisugi, Hojo and Imagawa, Shimazu and Otomo foreshadowed the struggles to come. The tools of unification, standing armies, firearms, fortified castles, and disciplined administration were already in place. What remained was for one man to seize them with sufficient vision and ruthlessness. The Sengoku Age thus stands as both an era of disintegration and of preparation. It shattered old hierarchies, but forged the instruments of future unity. It produced devastation, yet also resilience, chaos, yet also innovation. When Oda Nobunaga rose from the provinces in the mid-16th century, he inherited not a broken society, but one remade by a century of strife, a land accustomed to war, hardened by ambition, and ready at last for conquest on a national scale. Years of unending war showed Japan that castles and guns mattered as much as noble birth, that strict order could triumph over raw bravery, and that loyalty withered when reward was lacking. These truths would shape the unifiers who followed. For now, the land remained divided, each domain a kingdom unto itself, its lords bound by the sword and by the ceaseless struggle for survival. At Okehazama, the grey dawn pressed down with rain, as Nobunaga's warriors knelt in silence, mud clinging to their gear. Across the fields, Imagawa Yoshimoto's army gleamed with standards and steel, vast and sure of victory. Musicians played flutes and drums in the enemy camp, certain that victory was theirs. Then thunder broke, not from the clouds, but from men. Nobunaga hurled his outnumbered warriors downhill in a sudden charge, crashing into the unsuspecting Imagawa ranks. Confusion turned to panic, and within hours the great Yoshimoto lay slain. A minor warlord had shattered a power 10 times his size. From that day forward, Japan knew Nobunaga as more than a provincial upstart. He was the man who could unmake the Sengoku world. The Battle of Okehazama in 1560 marked the beginning of a campaign of relentless ambition. Nobunaga, lord of Owari province, transformed himself from a ridiculed youth known for eccentricity into the terror of rival daimyo. He forged alliances carefully, destroyed enemies decisively, and turned battlefield innovation into political dominance. Where others fought to preserve fragile traditions, he embraced change with ruthless clarity. One of his greatest tools was the firearm. The Portuguese matchlock, once a novelty, became the core of Nobunaga's strategy. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, he positioned rows of gunners behind wooden palisades, cycling their volleys in relentless rhythm. Takeda Shingen's famed cavalry, heirs to generations of mounted valor, broke and died before the thunder of massed musket fire. It was a revolution. No longer could samurai duels decide wars. Coordinated infantry with firearms now ruled the field. But Nobunaga's genius was not only military. He reshaped the economy of war. By securing control of trade routes, markets, and port towns, he turned commerce into a weapon. He encouraged merchants, reduced toll barriers, and promoted free markets within his territories. Wealth flowed into his coffers, sustaining armies larger than his rivals could imagine. In this, he proved that victory required not only courage, but also resources, that rice and silver could weigh as heavily as steel. Kyoto felt his presence with both awe and terror. When he marched into the capital, he restored order to streets long torn by war. Yet he did not hesitate to burn down Enryakuji, the great monastery on Mount Hiei, whose warrior monks had long defied daimyo and shogun alike. Flames consumed temples, statues, and scrolls as thousands perished. To Nobunaga, resistance was intolerable, whether from rival lords, monks, or even emperors. Authority had to be absolute, and he alone would wield it. His ambition extended beyond conquest. Nobunaga dreamed of unifying all Japan under his rule, ending the chaos of the Sengoku age. He courted foreign traders, welcomed Jesuit missionaries, and experimented with new technologies and ideas. His openness to Christianity was pragmatic. He saw in it a counterbalance to the Buddhist institutions that had opposed him. Missionaries marveled at his patronage, while rivals whispered of a man willing to embrace any tool for power. Even so, Nobunaga's story ended not in triumph, but in betrayal. In 1582, while lodged at Honnoji in Kyoto, he found himself surrounded by the forces of Akechi Mitsuhide, once a trusted general. Caught unprepared, Nobunaga chose death by fire and blade, rather than capture. The man who had broken the old order fell to treachery within his own ranks, but his vision did not die with him. His generals, determined to preserve his legacy, carried the banner of unification forward. Among them, Toyotomi Hideyoshi proved most remarkable. Born the son of a peasant foot soldier, he rose through talent and charisma to become Nobunaga's most trusted lieutenant. Where others scorned his lowly birth, Hideyoshi outwitted them on campaign after campaign, turning setbacks into victories. After Nobunaga's death, he moved swiftly, defeating Mitsuhide at Yamazaki and then overcoming rival claimants. Within years, Hideyoshi controlled more of Japan than Nobunaga had ever achieved. Hideyoshi's genius lay in consolidation. He recognized that unification required not only conquest, but also control of society itself. In 1588, he issued the Sword Hunt Edict, ordering the confiscation of weapons from peasants and monks. Henceforth, only the samurai class could bear arms. By this decree, he froze social mobility, separating warriors, farmers, artisans, and merchants into rigid categories. The distinction between ruler and subject became sharper than ever before, and the samurai stood alone as the armed elite. He also pursued land surveys, measuring fields with ruthless efficiency to determine exact tax obligations. Peasants could no longer conceal harvests or evade duties. Every grain of rice was counted. With these reforms, Hideyoshi built a stable foundation for rule, one that survived long after his death. Domains became bureaucratic as well as martial, with records and laws reinforcing the authority of their lords. Ambition drove him further still. With the islands pacified under his control, Hideyoshi turned his gaze abroad. In 1592, he launched an invasion of Korea, sending hundreds of ships across the sea. Samurai who had once fought each other now marched side by side on foreign soil. At first, they surged across the peninsula, overwhelming Korean defenses, but resistance stiffened and Ming China intervened. The war dragged on, draining resources and lives. A second invasion in 1597 ended in stalemate, with Japanese forces eventually retreating. Hideyoshi's dream of conquering the continent collapsed in exhaustion. These campaigns, however, left a profound mark on the samurai. For the first time, they fought not merely to defend domains or seize provinces, but as soldiers of a national cause, however tenuous. Tales of heroism and brutality spread on both sides, and the memory of overseas war haunted the generations that followed. Christianity, too, became entangled in Hideyoshi's reign. At first tolerant, he grew suspicious of missionaries' influence and their loyalty to foreign powers. In 1597, he ordered the execution of 26 Christians in Nagasaki, a grim warning of what would follow in later decades. Yet for a time, Christian lords flourished in Kyushu, their faith entwined with trade and politics. The presence of this new religion deepened Japan's entanglement with global currents, even as Hideyoshi sought to control it. By 1598, the great unifier lay dying, his Korean adventure undone, and his heirs still young. On his deathbed, he appointed a council of regents to protect his infant son, Hideyori. But his absence opened the way for new struggles. The sword hunts, land surveys, and class distinctions endured, yet the question of who would wield supreme power remained unanswered. The stage was set for another reckoning, one that would pit Hideyoshi's allies and rivals against each other in the decisive struggle to come. Under Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, Japan entered an age of transformation. The field of battle shifted from the honor of ritual combat to the cold precision of gunfire. The great lords ceased to wander as marauders, instead taking root as rulers of lands and people. Class hardened into iron divisions, samurai standing apart with their exclusive right to bear arms. Japan's vision widened too, drawn to Korea and beyond, and its harbors filled with ships carrying trade and new faiths from across the seas. For the first time, the fractured islands stood on the edge of true unity. The passing of Hideyoshi tore away the fragile balance he had built, and without his hand to guide the nation, Japan returned to the grim language of war. His heirs and rivals clashed, testing armies and loyalties alike. But the struggles of succession would not be theirs to win. Out of the ruin stepped Tokugawa Ieyasu, steady and relentless, who forged order from chaos and bound the country into stability it had long been denied. Mist clung to the valley of Sekigahara on an October morning in 1600 as thousands of men waited in silence. Rows of spears bristled like forests of steel. Matchlock gunners checked their powder in the damp air, and war banners crowded the slopes, snapping in the autumn wind. On one side stood Tokugawa Ieyasu, his army disciplined and prepared, banners marked with the triple hollyhock crest. Opposing him gathered the Western Army, loyalists to Toyotomi Hideyori, led by Yoshida Mitsunari. For hours, both sides stared across the field, each waiting for the moment that would decide the fate of Japan. The path to this confrontation began with the death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi in 1598. His infant son, Hideyori, inherited his name but not his authority. A council of regents, including Ieyasu, swore to guard the child's inheritance. Yet in the world of Sengoku ambition, oaths were fragile. Ieyasu, seasoned by decades of survival and betrayal, recognized that guardianship offered opportunity. While other regents quarreled, he tightened his grip on allies and vassals, securing loyalty through rewards and marriages. Tension mounted quickly. Ishida Mitsunari, Hideyoshi's loyal minister, distrusted Ieyasu's ambition. He gathered generals who had prospered under the Toyotomi and forged the Western coalition. Their cause proclaimed loyalty to Hideyori, but their unity was brittle, strained by rivalries and doubts. Meanwhile, Ieyasu rallied daimyo from the eastern provinces, men who saw in his leadership the promise of stability. By 1600, the stage was set for civil war. The armies converged on Sekigahara, a valley whose roads linked east and west. On the eve of battle, rain lashed the camps, soaking powder and chilling soldiers. Yet when dawn broke, thousands advanced beneath banners that turned the mist into a forest of colors. Ishida's forces initially held the advantage, their position strong, their numbers greater. But the tide of battle turned not on valor alone, but on betrayal. Kobayakawa Hideaki, whose army stood poised on the flank, wavered between sides. When Ieyasu's troops fired warning shots toward his position, he made his choice. His soldiers charged into Ishida's line, shattering it. Other lords followed his example, abandoning the Western cause. What had begun as a contest of arms dissolved into a rout. By afternoon, the Western army lay broken, corpses littering the fields of Sekigahara, and Ishida fled, only to be captured and executed. Victory at Sekigahara gave Tokugawa Ieyasu control of the land. Yet power required consolidation as well as triumph. He rewarded loyalists with rich domains and stripped enemies of lands. Fudai daimyo, hereditary allies, received strategic provinces near the capital. Tozama daimyo, who had joined him late or opposed him, were pushed to the frontiers, their strength hemmed in by careful placement. Through this redistribution, Ieyasu reshaped the political map, ensuring that loyalty and geography together secured his rule. Still, one obstacle remained: the Toyotomi legacy. Hideyori, now growing to adulthood, held Osaka Castle, the strongest fortress in Japan. Its towering walls and vast moats dominated the region, and thousands of retainers still swore to the Toyotomi name. Though Ieyasu styled himself shogun in 1603, confirmed by imperial decree, he knew that true security would elude him while Osaka remained a rival center of power. In the years that followed, Ieyasu built his authority through both law and spectacle. He established the Bakuhan system, a dual arrangement where the shogunate governed from Edo, while daimyo ruled their domains. Each lord retained autonomy in local affairs, but owed obedience to the shogun. Bonds of vassalage, sealed by oaths and hostages, ensured compliance. The emperor remained enthroned in Kyoto, cloaked in ritual prestige, but stripped of real influence. Dual rule continued, but the balance had decisively shifted eastward. Edo itself symbolized the new order. Once a fishing village, it grew into a metropolis under Tokugawa direction. Canals, roads, and warehouses transformed it into the hub of administration and commerce. Samurai filled its districts, artisans built its infrastructure, and merchants supplied its markets. Where Kyoto embodied refinement, Edo projected discipline and order, the capital of a warrior regime determined to last. Even so, Ieyasu's caution never faltered. He understood that the Toyotomi threat remained. In 1614, he found his pretext. Rumors spread that Hideyori minted coins and gathered monks for prayers of victory. Ieyasu declared him a rebel and marched with a massive host to Osaka. The winter campaign saw assaults against the castle's formidable walls, cannon thunder shaking the city. Though defenders resisted fiercely, negotiations ended the fighting. Ieyasu demanded the outer moat be filled, and once it was, Osaka's impregnable defenses were fatally weakened. The following year, war resumed. In the summer campaign of 1615, Tokugawa forces stormed Osaka once more. Battles raged through fields and villages, culminating in a final assault on the castle. Flames consumed towers, and blood stained the moats. Hideyori and his mother, Lady Yodogimi, chose death over capture, their lives ending in fire as the Toyotomi line perished. The last resistance to Tokugawa supremacy was extinguished. The siege of Osaka carried symbolic weight beyond military victory. With it, the age of constant war truly ended. For nearly a century and a half, Japan had been riven by conflict, its provinces ruled by ambition and steel. Now the Tokugawa shogunate stood unchallenged, its authority secured by arms, law, and the careful management of vassals. The sword had carved peace, and that peace would endure for generations. With Tokugawa, victory came a profound change in society. The samurai, no longer drifting from master to master in endless strife, were fixed as the governing class of each domain. Their weapons, once stained in pursuit of conquest, became symbols of discipline and guardianship, their loyalty bent towards stability rather than glory. Daimyo ruled, but under the watchful eye of Edo. Farmers tilled lands whose taxes supported the regime. Artisans crafted goods for castle towns, and merchants thrived in a network of regulated markets. The chaos of the Sengoku era gave way to a new stability, one that transformed warriors from conquerors into governors. Tokugawa Ieyasu himself did not long outlive his triumph. In 1616, he died at Sunpu, leaving his descendants a realm united under his house. Yet his legacy endured not only in blood, but in the structures he built. Through land distribution, strategic marriages, and ruthless elimination of rivals, he established a shogunate that would last more than 2 centuries. The Battle of Sekigahara and the Siege of Osaka thus marked the turning of the age. In muddy valleys and burning castles, the destiny of Japan shifted. The vision of unity dreamed by Nobunaga and enforced by Hideyoshi found permanence in the Tokugawa order. The age of warring states had ended. The age of regulated peace had begun. The smoke of Osaka Castle had barely cleared when the streets of Edo echoed with triumphal processions. Samurai marched in ranks, armor gleaming, banners high, while townsfolk crowded narrow lanes to watch the display. Drums thundered, conch shells sounded, and at the heart of the spectacle rode Tokugawa retainers carrying messages of victory. For the people of Edo, this was more than celebration. It was the announcement of a new age. The long years of ceaseless war were over. Now came the task of forging a system strong enough to ensure that peace would endure. Tokugawa Ieyasu's triumph in 1615 left no rival strong enough to challenge him. Yet the memory of centuries of upheaval weighed heavily. Victory at Sekigahara and the fall of Osaka had proven force, but sustaining unity required more than armies. The Tokugawa house sought to transform conquest into permanence, building institutions that could survive generations. The result was the Bakuhan system, a partnership between central authority in Edo and regional power in the hands of daimyo. From the shogun's perspective, control meant careful balance. Fudai daimyo, longtime Tokugawa allies, were rewarded with lands near the capital, their loyalty tested and trusted. Tozama daimyo, those who had surrendered late or fought against Tokugawa, were allowed to keep their domains, but relegated to distant provinces, far from the political heart. Shinpan daimyo, related by blood to the Tokugawa, occupied strategic positions as guardians of the dynasty. Through this distribution, geography itself became a tool of security. The loyal at the center, the dangerous at the periphery. Authority extended into law. In 1615, Ieyasu's successor, Tokugawa Hidetada, issued the Buke Shohato, the laws for the military houses. These regulations bound samurai and daimyo alike to codes of conduct. Marriages required shogunal approval, alliances were monitored, and construction of castles limited to 1 per domain. The laws forbade dueling, curbed extravagant display, and emphasized frugality. Behind each rule lay a clear intent to restrain ambition and prevent the rivalries that had once plunged Japan into chaos. Even as laws bound warriors, institutions bound lords. The Sankin Kotai, or alternate attendants, became the cornerstone of Tokugawa control. Daimyo were required to maintain residences in Edo and spend alternating years at court, leaving their families behind as hostages when they returned to their domains. The system drained resources, journeys across the archipelago consumed wealth, and the maintenance of Edo mansions imposed heavy costs. Yet it bound the lords to the capital, where their presence affirmed loyalty and their absence from home weakened potential rebellion. Edo itself blossomed under this system. Once a fishing village, it became a metropolis, as daimyo processions poured through its streets and retainers filled its districts. Inns, theaters, and markets flourished to serve travelers. Craftsmen built mansions, tailors clothed samurai, and merchants supplied goods from across the islands. Edo's growth embodied the transformation of a warrior capital into a city of administration and commerce, its order sustained by ritual as much as by arms. The Tokugawa also faced challenges of belief. Christianity, which had spread in the late Sengoku period, posed a threat to centralized authority. Missionaries preached loyalty to a foreign faith, and some daimyo in Kyushu openly embraced it. The regime, wary of divided allegiance, responded with harsh measures. By the 1620s, edicts outlawed Christianity and persecution intensified. The crisis reached its peak in the Shimabara Rebellion of 1637 to 1638. In Kyushu, heavily taxed peasants, many of them Christian, rose in revolt, seizing castles and declaring resistance against local lords and the shogunate. Their banners bore crosses as well as symbols of justice. For months, they held out against overwhelming odds, fortified in Hara Castle. When Tokugawa forces finally stormed the fortress, the slaughter was merciless. Tens of thousands perished, and Christianity in Japan was driven underground, surviving only in hidden communities along the coasts. The rebellion's suppression marked the last great battlefield of the samurai within Japan itself. From this point forward, peace reigned in ways unknown for centuries. Samurai, once hardened by constant campaigns, now found themselves serving as administrators. Their swords remained the badge of status, but their duties shifted to governance, keeping records, adjudicating disputes, and collecting taxes. Bureaucracy, not battle, became the rhythm of their lives. For many, the change proved unsettling. An identity forged in war had to adapt to service in offices and councils. Yet the transformation ensured stability. Rigid hierarchy underpinned the system. Society was divided into 4 formal classes: samurai, peasants, artisans, and merchants. Each had duties, each had limitations. Farmers provided the rice that supported the regime. Artisans produced tools and goods. Merchants, though officially at the bottom, supplied wealth that grew with trade. At the top stood the samurai, privileged yet burdened with responsibility. The hierarchy was presented as natural and eternal, a reflection of cosmic order. The Tokugawa also cultivated the emperor as a symbol of sacred legitimacy. In Kyoto, rituals continued, ceremonies reaffirmed the divine lineage, and poems were composed in the palace halls. Yet the emperor held no sword, commanded no armies. His authority lay in spiritual continuity, while the shogun exercised real power. The dual rule of earlier centuries had now hardened into a clear division. The emperor reigned, the shogun governed. Control extended even to movement and knowledge. Travel permits regulated who could cross provincial boundaries. Foreign contact was restricted under the policy of Sakoku, the closed country. Trade continued through Nagasaki with the Dutch and Chinese, but missionaries were banned and Japanese subjects forbidden to leave. Isolation did not mean stagnation, Chinese books, Dutch medicine, and foreign curiosities still entered, but the flow was tightly controlled, ensuring that no external influence could destabilize Tokugawa rule. Life under this order carried paradox. For commoners, peace brought security unknown in centuries of war. Rice harvests reached markets without fear of armies trampling fields. Towns grew around castles, commerce flourished, and theaters like kabuki entertained urban crowds. Yet burdens of taxation remained heavy, and peasants sometimes rioted when famine struck. For samurai, the peace that ensured their status also eroded their martial purpose. Without war, many sank into debt, dependent on stipends that lost value as commerce expanded. Still, the first decades of Tokugawa rule succeeded in their aim. From Edo to Kyushu, daimyo marched in ritual processions, their loyalty proclaimed in every step. Castle towns bustled, yet none dared rise against the shogunate. The swords that had carved Japan into fragments now enforced its unity. When Tokugawa Ieyasu died in 1616, he was enshrined at Nikko as Tosho Daigongen, the great deity of the East. Pilgrims climbed the mountain paths to marvel at the ornate shrine, its colors and carvings blending Shinto and Buddhist forms. In death, as in life, he embodied the fusion of sacred ritual and martial authority that defined the shogunate. His successors, Hidetada and Iemitsu, carried the work forward, deepening the structures that ensured control. By mid-century, the Tokugawa system had taken shape. The Bakuhan order balanced central authority with regional autonomy. Sankin Kotai tied lords to Edo, and the laws for the military houses restrained ambition. Christianity had been crushed, foreign contact restricted, and peace established across the land. What began in fire at Osaka had hardened into a regime of steel and parchment, banners and ledgers. The swords of the samurai had brought unity. Now their pens would preserve it. Each strike of the hammer sent sparks dancing, its rhythm filling the forge with sound. A young samurai watched intently while his master folded the glowing metal, striking again and again until the blade shone with layered strength. Yet when the weapon was finished, it would never know battle. It would hang at the youth's side in ceremonies, a symbol of duty rather than a tool of blood. The world into which he was born no longer demanded ceaseless war. Peace had become the rule, and with it came a question that haunted his class. What was the meaning of a warrior without war? The century following the fall of Osaka in 1615 brought stability unknown in Japan for generations. The Tokugawa order stood unchallenged, its laws enforced from Edo to Kyushu. Samurai, once hardened by campaigns, now served primarily as officials, clerks, and administrators. They collected taxes, judged disputes, and maintained order in castle towns. Their swords remained visible, but their hands turned increasingly to brush and ledger. The transformation was profound. A class defined by battle found itself governing in peace. This peace created an identity crisis. If a samurai no longer fought, what distinguished him from farmer, artisan, or merchant? Wealth alone did not suffice. Many warriors sank into debt while merchants thrived. Nor could simple ancestry preserve prestige forever. Something more was required, a philosophy that gave meaning to their existence. Out of this need emerged Bushido, the way of the warrior, a code that crystallized ideals drawn from centuries of practice, Confucian ethics, and Zen discipline. Among its early architects stood Yamaga Soko, a scholar steeped in Confucian learning. He argued that warriors should serve as moral exemplars for society. Farmers fed the land, artisans crafted goods, and merchants moved wealth. But the samurai preserved order by embodying virtue. Even in peace, their role was indispensable, not through constant fighting, but through righteousness, loyalty, and discipline. Yamaga's vision redefined the warrior's purpose, not a sword raised in endless combat, but a life lived in readiness, guided by principles that elevated service above self. These principles found dramatic expression in the most famous incident of the era, the tale of the 47 Ronin. In 1701, Lord Asano Naganori, angered by insults from the shogunate official Kara Yoshinaka, drew his sword within Edo Castle. For this breach of protocol, Asano was ordered to commit seppuku. His retainers, left masterless, Ronin, faced ruin. Yet under the leadership of Oishi Kuranosuke, they secretly plotted revenge. After nearly 2 years of patience, they struck on a snowy night in 1703, storming Kira's mansion and killing him. Then, having fulfilled their duty, they surrendered and were ordered to commit seppuku. The act electrified the nation. To some, the Ronin were criminals who had defied the law. To others, they embodied the highest ideal of loyalty, sacrificing life itself for their lord's honor. Plays, ballads, and woodblock prints spread their story, transforming them into symbols of Bushido in action. The debate around their deed, law versus loyalty, order versus honor, captured the tension at the heart of Tokugawa society. In peace, violence was forbidden, yet the memory of warrior virtue demanded recognition. The 47 Ronin bridged the gap, showing how the way of the warrior could persist even when swords were drawn only rarely. Alongside such dramas, martial traditions continued in new forms. Schools of fencing, archery, and spear combat proliferated, each codifying techniques into structured curricula. Students trained with wooden swords, practicing forms designed not only to sharpen skill, but to cultivate spirit. Masters wrote treatises that blended tactical instruction with philosophy, arguing that true mastery lay in calmness of mind and purity of intent. The dojo became the battlefield of the age, where sweat replaced blood and discipline replaced slaughter. One such work, the Hagakure, compiled in the early 18th century by Yamamoto Tsunetomo, gave voice to the starkest vision of Bushido. The way of the warrior is found in death, he declared, meaning that a samurai must live each day prepared to sacrifice his life without hesitation. Though written in a time of peace, the Hagakure exalted readiness for death as the core of honor. For some, this philosophy seemed impractical, even dangerous. For others, it captured the essence of a class that could not forget its origins in bloodshed. Samurai education broadened beyond martial schools. Confucian academies taught ethics, history, and governance. Young warriors studied the Chinese classics, memorized moral aphorisms, and debated questions of duty. Poetry and calligraphy were cultivated as signs of refinement, ensuring that the warrior remained not only skilled in arms, but also versed in culture. The balance of sword and brush became the ideal, embodying both the ferocity of battle and the grace of scholarship. Daily life reflected these shifts. In castle towns, samurai lived in designated districts, their residences lined in orderly rows. Stipends were paid in rice, measured by koku, but inflation and mismanagement often left households struggling. Many took up side pursuits, teaching, writing, or even lending money, despite prohibitions. Merchants grew wealthy, their warehouses filled with goods from across Japan and beyond, while samurai faced the paradox of rank without riches. Yet their honor, codified in Bushido, remained their defining treasure. With warriors as sponsors, artistic pursuits grew rich and varied. The tea ceremony, shaped by Sen no Rikyu in earlier generations, became a central practice, teaching humility, discipline, and simplicity. Gardens reflected Zen ideals of balance and impermanence. Theatre thrived, with kabuki dramatizing samurai stories for popular audiences, while No preserved its austere rituals under elite sponsorship. In these arts, warriors found ways to express values of restraint, loyalty, and beauty, even as swords grew ceremonial. Still, tensions persisted. Some samurai embraced the new ideals with devotion, seeing themselves as guardians of morality and culture. Others resented their bureaucratic roles, yearning for the days of open battle. The gap between ideal and reality widened as debts mounted and discipline frayed. Bushido served both as inspiration and as admonition, a mirror in which warriors measured themselves against an imagined perfection they could seldom reach. Through all this, the samurai retained their symbolic centrality. Commoners looked to them as models, dramatists celebrated their exploits, and philosophers codified their duties. Even as firearms reshaped warfare and merchants reshaped economies, the image of the sword-bearing retainer endured. It was less a reflection of daily life than a guiding myth, one that sustained the Tokugawa order by giving warriors a purpose beyond war. 18th century Japan saw Bushido crystallize into a complete philosophy. It drew on the legacy of battle, blending martial courage with Confucian ethics, Zen detachment, and the rituals of loyalty. The battlefield had faded, and the warrior had become administrator, scholar, and sponsor of the arts. But his role still centered on honor, loyalty, and sacrifice. The sword no longer carved kingdoms, yet it remained a symbol of the self. Bushido kept the spirit alive, giving warriors an identity even in peace. Winter rain spattered across the streets of Edo as a samurai hurried through the marketplace, his lacquered scabbard polished but his robe worn thin. Around him, merchants displayed bolts of silk and sacks of rice, their stalls humming with customers. Gold changed hands, voices bargained, and laughter spilled from tea houses. The warrior's purse, however, was light. His stipend, fixed in rice decades before, no longer met the price of daily life. He walked with the dignity of his class, but carried the quiet shame of debt. This was the paradox of late Tokugawa Japan, a society at peace, rich in commerce, yet one in which the warrior class, the supposed masters of the land, sank steadily into poverty. By the mid-18th century, the Tokugawa order had endured for more than a century and a half. Its peace was secure, its cities thriving, its hierarchy rigid, yet stability masked deep cracks. The stipends that supported samurai households were tied to rice, measured in koku. Inflation, rising costs of urban life, and the expansion of cash economies eroded their value. Warriors once supported by abundance found themselves unable to provide for families without borrowing. Merchants, officially at the bottom of the social order, lent money to samurai who now depended on their credit. The hierarchy that claimed warriors stood above commoners inverted in practice. Retainers in armor knocked at the doors of shopkeepers to ask for loans. Many samurai turned to side occupations. Some offered tutoring in calligraphy or Confucian learning. Others sold their services as writers or copyists. A few became bodyguards for the wealthy. Official codes frowned on such work, insisting that warriors live solely from stipends, but necessity outweighed regulation. In castle towns across the land, warriors pawned heirlooms, sold land rights, and concealed shame behind a facade of dignity. Rural unrest added to the burden. Peasant villages, pressed by taxes and bad harvests, erupted in protest. bands of farmers marched to castles demanding relief, sometimes attacking storehouses to seize rice. Samurai were dispatched to suppress these uprisings, yet many did so reluctantly. To punish villagers who suffered hunger seemed at odds with the warriors' supposed duty to protect. Still, loyalty to lords demanded obedience, and retainers found themselves enforcing order with sword and staff against the very people who sustained their stipends. Within this climate of strain, intellectual movements flourished. Scholars of kokugaku, or national learning, sought wisdom in Japan's ancient texts, emphasizing Shinto traditions and the uniqueness of the imperial line. Others pursued rangaku, Dutch learning, studying medicine, astronomy, and technology through books brought by limited foreign trade at Nagasaki. Samurai students copied diagrams of human anatomy, experimented with Western artillery, and debated the future of the nation. These studies gave the warrior class new outlets for curiosity, but also sharpened awareness that Japan lagged behind powers beyond its shores. For lower-ranking samurai, frustration deepened. Their stipends barely sustained daily needs, while higher retainers maintained privileges and ceremony. Anger simmered, sometimes breaking into violence against corrupt officials or arrogant merchants. Plays and popular tales reflected these tensions, depicting loyal warriors betrayed by unworthy masters or impoverished fighters struggling with dignity in a world of commerce. The culture of Bushido remained celebrated, but reality turned ideals into bitter irony. Efforts at reform punctuated the century. In the 1780s, Matsudaira Sadanobu launched the Kansei reforms, urging frugality among samurai, restricting extravagance, and promoting Confucian orthodoxy. Later, in the 1840s, Mizuno Tadakuni attempted the Tenpo reforms, banning luxury goods, relocating city populations, and demanding stricter discipline. Both initiatives sought to restore simplicity and moral order, yet neither resolved the deeper issue, a system that bound warriors to stipends while denying them the means to prosper in a monetized economy. Life in castle towns reflected these contradictions. Rows of samurai residences projected order, but behind paper screens, debts mounted. Families economized, wives managed household accounts with ingenuity, and children often grew up aware that their status exceeded their means. Meanwhile, merchants in bustling markets amassed fortunes, sponsoring theaters, financing rice exchanges, and lending discreetly to impoverished retainers. The official hierarchy remained unchanged, yet the reality of wealth shifted the balance of society. Cultural life did not wither despite hardship. Samurai continued to patronize arts, preserving no theater and supporting new schools of martial training. Many studied swordsmanship less for battle than for moral discipline, treating practice as meditation. Calligraphy, painting, and poetry remained signs of refinement. Yet the contrast between lofty ideals and practical struggle was never far away. A warrior might compose verses extolling loyalty while bargaining with creditors to keep rice on the table. The tension reached into politics. By the early 19th century, foreign ships began appearing more frequently off Japan's coasts. Russian envoys, British whalers, and later American traders tested the edges of Tokugawa isolation. Samurai administrators debated responses. Some urged opening to trade, others warned of disaster. The old order, long insulated from external threats, felt new pressure. For many, the sight of foreign sails symbolized not only danger, but also the inadequacy of a warrior class consumed by debt and ritual. Among the lower retainers, voices grew sharper. Some embraced radical Confucian teachings that demanded lords rule with justice and provide relief to subjects. Others turned to Shinto nationalism, proclaiming the emperor as the true sovereign and criticizing the shogunate as corrupt. These ideas remained scattered, but they revealed cracks in the ideological foundation of Tokugawa rule. Samurai were no longer united solely by loyalty to their lords. Intellectual ferment offered alternative visions of duty and destiny. Everywhere, contradictions deepened. The samurai remained symbols of authority, carrying swords that no merchant could bear. Yet merchants funded their households. They preached honor and frugality, yet debts forced compromises. They ruled villages through governors and inspectors, yet faced riots and resistance they could barely suppress. Their identity as warriors endured, but it no longer matched the realities of their existence. As the 1800s wore on, decline became impossible to ignore. Samurai paced castle streets with the pride of old rank, but the worry of empty purses. Peasants still carried the load through rice taxes, merchants rose on currents of credit, and reformers called for renewal of virtue. Yet the warriors' standing continued to slip away. The class that had once imposed order with sword and bow was now ensnared in its own structure, too privileged to change, too overburdened to prosper. The decline did not erase the samurai's symbolic power. Plays, prints, and parables celebrated their past glories, ensuring that the image of the loyal retainer remained vivid. Yet the more they were honored in story, the more their struggles in reality stood out. The warrior had become both hero of the imagination and debtor in the marketplace, a contradiction that defined the twilight of the Tokugawa peace. When black-hulled ships would one day appear in Edo Bay, their cannons gleaming with foreign steel, they would meet a society still outwardly ruled by the sword. But beneath the lacquered armor and polished hilts lay a class worn thin by debt, clinging to ideals that no longer matched their world. The decline of the samurai was not sudden. It was lived daily in rice shortfalls, in unpaid stipends, in borrowed coins hidden within a warrior's sleeve. Black smoke rose over Edo Bay as 4 warships, their hulls iron dark and their masts bare of sails, drifted into view. On their decks, cannons bristled and flags snapped in the wind. Fishermen gaped, merchants panicked, and samurai hurried to the shore, hands on hilts that felt suddenly obsolete. It was July 1853, and Commodore Matthew Perry's arrival shattered 2 centuries of isolation. The Black Ships, as the people called them, signaled not only the demands of foreign powers, but the beginning of the samurai's final chapter. The Tokugawa shogunate, long unchallenged, found itself trapped. Perry's guns made clear that Japan could not resist Western fleets with outdated weapons. Debate split the samurai elite. Some urged resistance, invoking the honor of the nation. Others counseled negotiation, recognizing the futility of defiance. The resulting treaties, signed under duress, opened ports to foreign trade and eroded the shogunate's legitimacy. For many warriors, the concessions were humiliation, proof that the government could no longer defend the land. From this discontent grew the rallying cry of Sono Joy. Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. Samurai across the provinces seized upon the slogan, turning anger at the West into rebellion against the shogunate. Young retainers from Choshu, Satsuma, and Tosa sharpened their blades, plotted in secret, and sometimes struck openly, assassinating officials they deemed traitors. Kyoto's streets became scenes of bloodshed as radical warriors sought to purge foreign influence through terror. The sword regained its edge, but now it was turned inward toward fellow Japanese. The emperor, long cloistered in ritual obscurity, emerged as a symbol of resistance. Rebels proclaimed that true sovereignty lay with him, not the shogun. The court, once politically sidelined, became the rallying point for a new order. The samurai, who had spent centuries serving shoguns in Edo, now began to shift allegiance toward Kyoto and the imperial cause. Loyalty, the core of Bushido, was rewritten in the fires of revolution. Conflict sharpened through the 1860s. Domains such as Choshu and Satsuma modernized their armies, importing Western rifles and cannons, drilling troops in European formations. These reformers, once provincial rivals, found common cause in opposition to the Tokugawa. Civil war became inevitable. In 1868, banners bearing the imperial chrysanthemum clashed with Tokugawa crests in the Boshin War, a struggle that spread from Kyoto to Edo and beyond. Battles like Toba Fushimi revealed the new face of war. Imperial forces, armed with modern rifles and artillery, outmatched Tokugawa samurai, who still relied heavily on traditional weapons. Armor and sword met bullet and shell, and the outcome was never in doubt. By spring, the shogunate's armies retreated, and Edo surrendered without catastrophic destruction. Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the last shogun, yielded authority to the emperor, ending more than 2.5 centuries of Tokugawa rule. The Meiji Restoration proclaimed a new beginning. Power shifted to the emperor and his advisors, many of them samurai from victorious domains. Yet the victory of the imperial cause did not preserve the old warrior order. It dismantled it. Step by step, the foundations of samurai privilege crumbled. Domains were abolished in 1871, replaced by prefectures under central authority. Stipends, the lifeblood of samurai households, were commuted into government bonds that quickly lost value. Samurai who had lived for generations as stipended retainers found themselves impoverished, with no role in the new bureaucracy or modern army. Even their swords, the symbols of their identity, were stripped away. The 1876 decree banning the wearing of swords in public ended centuries of visible distinction. To carry a blade now was to mark oneself as a relic of a vanished age. Samurai who once strode proudly through castle towns with 2 swords at their sides now walked the same streets indistinguishable from merchants and farmers. The way of the warrior had become memory. Not all accepted this transformation quietly. Dispossessed retainers, frustrated by poverty and insulted by loss of privilege, rose in scattered revolts. Some attacked government offices, others plotted conspiracies. The most dramatic resistance came in 1877 in the Satsuma Rebellion. Led by Saigo Takamori, once a hero of the Restoration itself, thousands of former samurai took up arms against the government they had helped to create. Saigo's men fought with valor, wielding swords against conscript soldiers armed with rifles and artillery. Early victories inspired hope, but the imbalance of firepower proved decisive. At the final battle of Shiroyama, imperial troops encircled the rebels, pounding their positions with cannon. Saigo, mortally wounded, is said to have met death by his own hand rather than surrender. His followers charged in a last desperate assault, cut down in waves. With their fall, the last great stand of the samurai ended. The rebellion's defeat confirmed the new order. Japan's army would henceforth be one of conscripts, trained and equipped in modern fashion, loyal to the emperor rather than to local lords. The samurai, once the armed backbone of society, were gone as a class. Their spirit lived on in stories, plays, and memory, but their role in politics and war was finished. Still, the fall of the samurai was not merely tragedy. Their dissolution made possible the transformation of Japan into a modern state. Freed from the rigid hierarchy of domains and stipends, the nation embraced reforms in education, industry, and military organization. Within a generation, Japan stood as a rising power on the world stage. But the cost of that transformation was the end of the warrior order that had shaped the land for nearly 1,000 years. From the smoke of Perry's ships to the ashes of Shiroyama, the final act of the samurai unfolded in less than 3 decades. It was an ending both swift and merciless, yet also dramatic and unforgettable. In their fall lay the closing of one age and the birth of another. Twilight settled over the ruins of Shiroyama, and the silence that followed the last charge of Saigo Takamori's men lingered like a haunting. Rifles lay scattered among broken swords, banners trampled into the mud. Survivors whispered that the final warriors had died on their feet, cutting their way through gunfire until overwhelmed. In the hills above Kagoshima, villagers gathered relics, hilts, helmets, fragments of armor, treating them not as spoils but as sacred reminders. The samurai had fallen, yet in their passing they became something more enduring than a class. They became legend. The decades that followed their abolition forced former retainers into new lives. Some found roles in the bureaucracy of the Meiji state, serving as police, teachers, or officials. Others turned to farming, their swords traded for plows. Many slipped quietly into obscurity, their families reduced to commoners overnight. Yet memory of their heritage remained powerful. Children were taught to revere ancestors who had once borne 2 swords, even when those weapons hung rusting on the wall. Lineage itself became a source of dignity, a private shield against the humiliation of lost privilege. Castles across Japan echoed with emptiness. Moats lay stagnant, towers crumbled, and once bustling garrisons became administrative offices or schools. Yet ruins carried their own weight. Travelers who climbed stone steps or touched charred gates spoke of hearing echoes, hoofbeats in courtyards, the clang of drills, the voices of men who had vanished. Even as practical rule passed into the hands of bureaucrats, the physical landscape reminded people of the warriors who had shaped it. Theatre carried the image forward. Kabuki and bunraku dramatized tales of loyalty and vengeance, drawing packed audiences in Edo, Osaka, and provincial towns. The 47 Ronin appeared again and again upon the stage, their snowy night attack retold with pathos and grandeur. Crowds wept at the sight of retainers sacrificing themselves for honor, finding in their story consolation for a vanished age. The stage became a mirror where society could revisit the virtues of the samurai without confronting the complexities of their decline. Woodblock prints carried similar power. Scenes of Yoshitsune leaping across rooftops or Benkei holding a bridge against an army appeared in bright colors, pinned to the walls of commoners' homes. The prints cost little, yet they gave immortality to figures long dead. Through them, the warrior past became household memory, accessible to farmers and merchants as well as to descendants of the class itself. Within households, heirlooms preserved lineage. A sword handed down through generations became less a weapon than a relic, wrapped in silk and unwrapped only on festival days. Armor displayed in alcoves reminded families of ancestors who had served with honor. Though the sword ban of 1876 stripped warriors of their public distinction, in private the symbols endured, turned from badges of privilege into talismans of identity. At the same time, martial traditions found new forms. Schools of fencing, archery, and spearwork continued, though their purpose shifted. Instructors taught not preparation for battle, but cultivation of character. Wooden swords replaced steel. Drills became rituals of discipline. Parents sent sons to dojos not to ready them for war, but to teach them composure, endurance, and honor. Martial arts became repositories of samurai spirit, transmitting values when the battlefield had vanished. Philosophy also played its part. Texts such as Yamagusoko's writings and the Hagakure were copied and studied by scholars and enthusiasts. Readers debated the meaning of loyalty, the balance between law and honor, and the readiness to die. For some, these works offered guidance in a world transformed by industrial change and foreign influence. For others, they were relics, curiosities from a time already receding. Yet their survival testified to a hunger for continuity, a desire to preserve the inner essence of the warrior, even when the outer form was gone. Saigo Takamori himself became a figure of myth. To the government, he was a rebel defeated by modern arms. To many ordinary people, he was a tragic hero, the last great samurai who remained loyal to ideals even when the world had changed. Poems and stories celebrated him, sometimes softening his rebellion into noble sacrifice. In memory, his death at Shiroyama joined the great canon of samurai tales, linking him with Yoshitsune, the Ronin, and countless others who had died in defense of loyalty. The contrast between reality and memory grew sharper with each passing year. In cities like Tokyo and Osaka, merchants thrived, railways spread, and factories rose. Men in Western suits strode through streets where once only samurai carried swords. Yet on stage, in prints, and in memory, the warrior remained central. The image of the man who lived for loyalty, who died for honor, haunted the imagination even as Japan remade itself. In castle towns, former retainers gathered for reunions, telling stories of campaigns and ancestors, reminding one another of the bonds that had once defined them. Though stripped of status, they clung to memory as a way of keeping community alive. In this, the samurai became ghosts not of terror, but of belonging, spirits that gave shape to a rapidly changing world. By the last decades of the 19th century, the samurai existed only in fragments. A lacquered helmet displayed in a family alcove, a scroll recalling a retainer's service, a scarred stone wall rising from the weeds of an abandoned stronghold. These were the traces that survived the sword-bearing elite. What had once been a living order became memory, preserved in objects, in stories, and in rituals passed quietly from parent to child. Their presence lingered not in the power to command, but in the reverence with which the past was carried forward. The warrior class had ended, but the warrior spirit had not. It lingered in memory, in ritual, and in art. It endured in the reverence of descendants and the imagination of a nation. The samurai became ghosts not of fear, but of reverence, haunting Japan not as rulers, but as symbols of honor, loyalty, and sacrifice. So the tale closes, not with the clamor of battle, but with echoes. The clang of swords has faded, the smoke of sieges dispersed, yet the samurai remain, no longer masters of Japan, but shadows that still walk its history.